If your family comes from Sicily, you have been told one simple thing about where you come from your whole life. You are Italian. And you are. That is not in question. But that word is doing something quiet and a little dishonest. It is covering a story about your ancestry that is far older, far stranger, and far larger than a single country. Here is the fact that should stop you. Italy, as a country, is younger than the United States. It did not exist as one nation until 1861. Sicily is more than 3,000 years older than the label stamped on it. So when a Sicilian finally takes a DNA test, expecting to see one word, Italian, and instead gets a list that runs across the entire Mediterranean, it feels like an error in the results. It is not an error. It is the truth that the label was hiding. This is what your Sicilian DNA actually carries, and it is the record of nearly every civilization that ever mattered in that sea. Let us be fair to the word Italian first, because it is not wrong. Sicilians are Italian citizens. They share the language, the church, and centuries of history with the mainland. The pride in that is real and earned, and nothing here takes it away. But identity and ancestry are two different things. And the moment you look underneath the cultural label, at the genetic record, the simple version falls apart. Because Sicily is not a quiet corner of Italy. Look at where it actually sits. It is a stepping stone in the dead center of the Mediterranean Sea, halfway between Europe and Africa, exactly on the line between the eastern and western halves of the ancient world. For 3,000 years, that position made it the single most fought-over island in that sea, and every power that fought for it left something behind. Not just ruins and temples, people, bloodlines, the genetic signature of empires that arrived, settled, married in, and moved on. So the real question was never whether Sicilians are Italian. The question is what was already there, layer beneath layer, long before Italy was even a word. Here is what this video is going to do. We are going to dig through Sicilian ancestry the way you would dig through soil, from the top layer down to the bedrock. Every civilization that shaped it in order, and what each one actually left in the genome. Then we will look at the hard numbers from modern genetic studies, the ones that surprise people most. And at the end, we will sit with the single piece of this that scientists are still arguing about. By the time we are done, the word Italian will not feel wrong to you. It will just feel like the newest and thinnest layer sitting on top of something enormous. Let us start at the bedrock. Long before the Greeks, before Rome, before anyone wrote the island's story down, Sicily already had people on it. Ancient writers and modern archaeology point to three original peoples: the Sicani, considered the oldest, and thought to be indigenous to the island itself, the Sikels, who crossed from mainland Italy around the 13th century before the Common Era, and who gave Sicily the name it still carries, and the Elymians in the northwest, a people whose own origin remains a small mystery, possibly arriving from Anatolia or the Aegean, carrying a thread of the eastern Mediterranean into the island before recorded history even starts. Sit with that for a moment. Before a single Greek ship appeared on the horizon, Sicily was already the product of at least three different peoples, one of them likely from the far side of the sea. And we can see it in the oldest bones. Ancient DNA pulled from Bronze Age skeletons on the island already shows a mixture of ancestries, European and Eastern Mediterranean lineages sitting side by side, thousands of years before any Greek or Arab arrived. Sicily did not slowly become mixed over time. Sicily began mixed and simply never stopped. That is the pattern for everything that follows. There was never a single founding people here to dilute. The island was layered from the very bottom. Then the ships came. The first great wave arrived by sea, from two directions at once. From the east came the Phoenicians, traders out of what is now Lebanon, the finest sailors of the ancient world. From around the 8th century before the Common Era, They planted trading posts on Sicily's western end. One of them they called Panormus. You know it today as Palermo, the island's capital. The Phoenicians did not come to conquer. They came to trade. But traders settle and settlers marry, and their bloodline entered the western edge of the island and never left it. And at almost the same moment, the Greeks arrived. The Greeks came to stay. Beginning around 735 before the Common Era, Greek colonists founded city after city: Naxos, Syracuse, Acragas, the modern Agrigento, whose temples still stand today. So many Greek cities, so densely settled that this part of the world earned a name of its own: Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. And this was no rustic frontier of the Greek world. It was one of its beating hearts. Syracuse grew into one of the largest and most powerful cities in all of Greece. Powerful enough that when Athens sent a massive fleet to conquer it in 413 before the Common Era, Syracuse destroyed that fleet completely. This was the Sicily of Archimedes, the greatest mathematician of antiquity, born in Syracuse and killed there when the Romans finally stormed its walls. For 3 centuries, Greek Sicily was not on the edge of civilization. It was the center of it, and you can still stand inside that layer today. The Valley of the Temples at Agrigento holds the most complete and best preserved concentration of ancient Greek temples anywhere outside Greece itself, 7 of them, raised in the 5th century before the Common Era, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Greek theater at Syracuse is still used for performances 2,500 years after it was cut into the hillside. And the Sicilian dialect still carries Greek words that ordinary people use every day without ever thinking about where they came from. That is not a historical footnote. That is a civilization that sank into the island and stayed. And here is where the genetics becomes remarkable. Because that Greek layer never faded, modern DNA studies estimate that roughly 37% of the ancestry of Sicilians today traces back to those ancient Greek migrants. More than a third. Not a footnote, not a trace. The single largest ancient component in the Sicilian genome is Greek. So the next time someone calls a Sicilian simply Italian, remember that the biggest single piece of their deep ancestry was laid down by people who spoke Greek and built temples to Zeus 7 centuries before Rome ruled the island at all. But the Greeks were not alone out there. To the south and west, another power was watching. While the Greeks held the east of Sicily, the west belonged to Carthage, the great North African Empire, itself founded by Phoenicians, sitting just across the water in what is now Tunisia. For centuries, Greek Sicily and Carthaginian Sicily ground against each other in a slow series of wars. And that conflict is what finally pulled in a third power, Rome. The struggle over Sicily became the spark for the First Punic War, from 264 to 241 before the Common Era. When the dust settled, Rome had taken the island, and Sicily became the very first Roman province outside the Italian mainland. And Rome did not simply govern Sicily, it fed on it. The island became Rome's granary, worked by enormous estates of enslaved people, brought in from across the Mediterranean and the East. So many that Sicily erupted into 2 massive slave revolts in the 2nd century, before the Common Era. That is part of the genetic record too. Every one of those forced arrivals, from Greece, from Anatolia, from North Africa, pressed another thread into a population that was already among the most mixed in the ancient world. So before we are even halfway through the story, Sicily has been indigenous, Phoenician, Greek, Carthaginian, and Roman. And each of those left a mark you can still read today. Here is where we can get specific, because the male line tells its own clear story. When geneticists look at the Y chromosome of Sicilian men, they find a layered map of exactly these arrivals. Around 37% carry a lineage called R1b, the signature of Italic and broader Western European ancestry. Up to 30% carry J2, a lineage that spread out of Anatolia and the Levant with the first farmers deep in the Neolithic. and around 18% carry E1b1b, a lineage rooted in ancient North Africa, the genetic echo of those Phoenician and Carthaginian centuries on the western half of the island. Read that list again slowly. Western European, Anatolian and Levantine, North African, 3 continents written into the Y chromosome of a single population. That is not what one national label prepares you for. And notice what that means about the phrase ethnically Italian. There is no single Italian genetic signature hiding underneath Sicily. What is underneath Sicily is a stack, each layer arriving with a fleet, an army, or a trading ship, and each one still detectable in the men walking around Palermo and Catania today. And the most transformative arrival was still to come. In the 9th century of the Common Era, Sicily changed hands again, and this time the change went deep. Arab armies crossed from North Africa and, over decades, took the island. For roughly 200 years, Sicily was an emirate, a Muslim state at the very heart of the Christian Mediterranean. The Arab period reshaped Sicily in ways that outlasted it completely. Under Arab rule, Palermo swelled into one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the Mediterranean world. They brought citrus, sugarcane, and cotton, and a network of irrigation that turned the island into a garden. Words still spoken in the Sicilian dialect today come straight from Arabic. For 2 centuries, Sicily was less a European island than a northern shore of the Arab world. Now this is the point in the story where we have to be careful and precise, because it is the part most often exaggerated in both directions. The Arab and North African contribution to Sicilian ancestry is real, and it is measurable. On the autosomal level, studies estimate roughly 6% North African ancestry across Sicilians. On the male line, the specifically Arab-era North African contribution is estimated somewhere between 0 and about 7.5%, depending on the region and the study. So let us say plainly what that means and what it does not. It does not mean Sicilians are North African. It does mean that a real, traceable thread of North African and Middle Eastern ancestry runs through the Sicilian genome, modest in size, unmistakable in presence, laid down over centuries when the island belonged to the Arab world. One more layer, not the whole cloth. One more color in a weave that already had many. And then, one final people arrived to rule. And this time, the ruler made the mixing official. His name was Roger II, and he was a Norman. The Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France, swept into Sicily in the 11th century and took it from the Arabs. On Christmas Day, 1130, Roger II was crowned the first king of Sicily in Palermo. But here is what makes Roger unforgettable, and what makes him the perfect symbol of this entire island. He did not erase what he conquered. He governed on top of it. His court operated in 3 languages at once: Latin, Greek, and Arabic. He minted his coins with Arabic inscriptions. He kept a brilliant Arab geographer, Al-Idrisi, at his side to map the known world. And Al-Idrisi produced something extraordinary: a book and a world map, the Tabula Rogeriana, that would remain among the most accurate descriptions of the Earth for the next 300 years. And if you want to see that fusion with your own eyes, it still stands in Palermo today. The Palatine Chapel, where Byzantine Greek mosaics glitter beneath a wooden ceiling, carved by Arab craftsmen in the honeycombed style of a mosque. All of it built for a Norman Christian king. 3 civilizations in one room holding each other up. Stand in Roger's court for a second, and you are standing inside the whole story at once. A Christian Norman king, descended from Vikings, governing Greek and Arab and Latin subjects, in a former Muslim emirate, on a formerly Greek island that had once been Carthaginian and Phoenician, and before all of it, Sicani and Sikels and Elymian. Sicily's mixing was never only in the blood. For a few remarkable generations, It was the official language of the state. That is the island your ancestors actually came from, not a quiet province. A crossroads that governed itself in 3 tongues. So if the real story is this rich, why does everyone just say Italian? Part of the answer is simply how recent Italy is. The country became one nation in 1861. Close enough that some people's great-great-grandparents were alive. And when millions of Sicilians emigrated to America in the decades that followed, they arrived carrying a national label barely a generation old. The country they arrived in flattened it further. To an immigration officer in New York, a Sicilian was simply Italian, and often not even treated as fully that. The scale of that arrival was staggering. In the decades around 1900, millions of Italians crossed to America, and a very large share of them came from Sicily and the South. Among the poorest and most crowded corners of the new country, they arrived speaking a dialect the mainland barely recognized, into a society that sorted people quickly and harshly. Becoming simply Italian-American was a way to belong. And the older, stranger, more Mediterranean truth of where they had come from got folded away inside a single generation, told to almost no one, until a grandchild spat into a tube a century later and watched it come back. And here is the quieter, harder part. The very components of Sicilian ancestry that came from Africa and the Middle East have, at times, been used against Sicilians as a way of casting them as something less than fully European in eras when that judgment carried real consequences for where you could live and work. Faced with that, blending quietly into a single, uncomplicated Italian identity was not merely easier, it was safer. So the label did a job. It smoothed a 3,000-year Mediterranean crossroads down into one tidy word. It made a complicated people simple, at the cost of making them far smaller than they actually were. The DNA is now undoing that, quietly, one test result at a time. At this point, you might be thinking the obvious thing. Fine, so Sicilians are a mix, but isn't everyone? Isn't every population on Earth of somebody? That is true. And it is exactly the wrong way to shrink this story. Because yes, every population is mixed, but very few populations have their mixing written down this clearly, this completely, across this much time. Most peoples are a blend whose ingredients were lost centuries ago. Sicily is a blend where we can still name almost every ingredient, and the century it arrived, and sometimes the harbor it sailed into. Sicani, Phoenician, Greek, Carthaginian, Roman, Arab, Norman. That is not a vague genetic smoothie. It is a dated, documented archive. Think about what that means next to a so-called pure lineage. A population that stayed sealed off for 3,000 years would carry a thin, repetitive genetic record. The same story copied over and over. Sicilians carry the opposite. A dense, dated stack of the entire Mediterranean, every layer still legible. In the language of ancestry, that is not dilution. That is wealth. A single unbroken bloodline would have less history in it, not more. Sicilians have the opposite problem. They have too much history to fit inside one word. So when a Sicilian opens a DNA result and sees Greek and North African and Middle Eastern and Western European all sitting in the same report, that is not a confused or smudged ancestry. It is a guest list. It is the record of every civilization that ever decided the center of the Mediterranean was worth crossing the sea for. The Phoenician trader who founded Palermo, the Greek colonist who raised the temples at Agrigento, the Carthaginian soldier on the western shore, the Roman governor counting grain, the Arab farmer who planted the first citrus, the Norman knight who became a king and ruled in 3 languages. Every one of them is still there in the people of Sicily today. When you look at a Sicilian face, you're not looking at one nation. You're looking at 3,000 years of the Mediterranean still walking around. That is not a thinner heritage than Italian. It is one of the deepest inheritances a person can carry. And the story is not finished being written because the science itself is still arguing. The broad picture is settled. The Greek layer, the Western European core, the Eastern and North African threads, all confirmed, all measurable. What remains genuinely debated is the precise size and timing of some of those layers, above all the Arab and North African contribution, where honest estimates still run from almost nothing up to around 7.5%. New ancient DNA, pulled from older and older Sicilian remains, is slowly sharpening the picture, telling us not only what sits in the modern genome, but exactly when each piece arrived. And some of the peoples in that weave will probably never be separated out again. The Sicani, the Elymians, the oldest layers are so deep and so long ago that they survive now only as a faint signal inside their descendants, impossible to fully name. But that is the nature of a true crossroads. You do not get a clean answer, because a clean answer would be a lie. What you get instead is a better question. Your Sicilian ancestry is not what you were told. It is far more than that. And the last few layers of exactly how much are still being read. If a single word can hide 3,000 years of ancestry, you should see what happens when families claim an ancestry they never actually had. Watch the story of the millions of Americans who were certain they were part Cherokee, and what the DNA and the records actually found. It is the same question about labels and bloodlines turned completely around. And if your family comes from Sicily, tell us which town and what you were always told about where your people came from. We read everyone.